Well, a new study confirms it. Men under the age of 40 who get the vaccine have a higher risk of myocarditis than men under the age of 40 who catch COVID-19. We've heard this throughout the pandemic that you're more likely to have myocarditis from COVID than from the vaccine. So you should just get the vaccine. You will be safer. But a new study actually disputes this and says that is not true if you are a man under the age of 40. Now, the data does show, according to the reports, that for women under the age of 40, for women over the age of 40, for men over the age of 40, that the risk of myocarditis is greater after infection with COVID-19. But I haven't been able to comb through the data very specifically, and I'll get to why that may or may not be completely accurate. But let's start off with what they do confirm, and that is for certain that men under the age of 40 have a higher risk of myocarditis after vaccination. Now, here is the report that came from the American Heart Association. They're reporting on the study. It says COVID-19 infection poses higher risk for myocarditis than vaccines. Now, they could have put a subtitle in there saying, except for men under the age of 40. That would have been, I think, the prudent thing to do because they know people are just going to read headlines. And if people are just skimming, then they say, well, then I'm just going to go get the vaccine because this is what the American Heart Association says. So I'm going to go grab it. And it's only until you get towards the end of this article that it says, except for men under the age of 40. Men under the age of 40 is a really large group of people. All the college students who are being mandated to get the vaccine. You've got high school students, elementary students that are being mandated in certain areas of the country to get the vaccine. Now, I know Washington, D.C. just recently put it on hold, saying that they're going to resume their vaccination policy for young students in January. Los Angeles has said something similar. A lot of these districts are putting it on hold or on pause while they reevaluate. But this type of data is extremely concerning. I know if it were me and the school district said your young son, your 16-year-old son or your 14-year-old son is going to be mandated to take the vaccine, I would have to go to homeschooling. There's no way I would risk it after this data. And here is the data. You just have to hope that people actually listen to this. Let's go through the article. The overall risk of myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle, is substantially higher immediately after being infected with COVID-19 than it is in the weeks following vaccination for the coronavirus, a large new study in England shows. The detailed analysis of nearly 43 million people was published Monday in the American Heart Association journal Circulation. So 43 million, this is a very large group of people. We found that across this large data set, the entire COVID-19 vaccinated population of England during an important 12-month period of the pandemic when the COVID-19 vaccines first became available, the risk of myocarditis following COVID-19 vaccination was quite small compared to the risk of myocarditis after COVID-19 infection. So let's scroll down a bit here. Previous research from around the world, including reports from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, has shown a potential increased risk of myocarditis after receiving an mRNA COVID-19 vaccine. In the new study, researchers analyzed records from England's National Immunization Database for nearly 43 million people, 13 or older, who had received at least one dose of COVID-19 vaccine between December 1st of 2020 and December 15th of 2021, so a little over an entire year. More than 21 million had received 3 doses of the vaccine, the initial 2-shot regimen plus a booster. Nearly 6 million tested positive for COVID-19 either before or after receiving a vaccine. During the 1-year study period, 2,861 people, or 0.007%, were hospitalized or died with myocarditis. So they're saying that is the group for all, that is the number of people for all of the groups. So whether you be vaccinated with AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, or unvaccinated, if you've been vaccinated once, twice, or 3 times, or unvaccinated, that is the entire number of people who ended up being diagnosed with myocarditis and were hospitalized or died with myocarditis. Now, you could have subclinical myocarditis where you don't even have any symptoms until they do run tests. This is what the Thailand study did. They ran some tests and they said, oh, shoot, kind of a lot of you have subclinical myocarditis. It was 1 in 43 that had either myocarditis or subclinical myocarditis or pericarditis or subclinical pericarditis. This, on the other hand, is saying, not really on the other hand, but this is just saying that 2,861 people had clinical, hospitalized, or death levels of myocarditis. So very severe myocarditis. The analysis showed people infected with COVID-19 before receiving a vaccine were 11 times more at risk for developing myocarditis within 28 days of testing positive for the virus, but that risk was cut in half if a person was infected after receiving at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. The risk for myocarditis increased after receiving the first dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine and after a first, second, and booster dose of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, but the risk of myocarditis associated with the vaccine was lower than the risk associated with COVID-19 infection before or after vaccination, with one exception, they say. Men under 40 who received a second dose of the Moderna vaccine had a higher risk of myocarditis following vaccination. The Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines are available in the U.S. Now, I'm going to show you why it's not just the Moderna vaccine that has a higher rate of myocarditis. It's actually all of them have a higher rate of myocarditis, but Moderna has a significantly higher rate. In fact, it should have been banned for people under the age of 40. The risk is so great. And it was banned in much of Scandinavia, in Germany. They limited Moderna, and I believe even I think France. There were a few other countries in Europe that banned Moderna entirely, or they banned it for at least men under the age of 30. And absolutely, when you look at this data, it should have been banned, but it's still being offered for men under the age of 30. It's still being offered. And you have to wonder how many of these clinics that are offering vaccines don't see these studies and they're still out there administering them to anyone who walks in the door. Now, one thing about that paragraph there I want to point out, it says, so this is saying that there is an increased risk after the first dose of AstraZeneca, after a first, second, and booster dose of Pfizer or Moderna. But they're saying there's a greater risk after infection with COVID. But you're at a lowest risk if you don't get the vaccine and you don't get COVID. That is your lowest possible risk. But you would be risking because probably everybody's going to get COVID. So they're saying you're still better off getting the vaccine, except for men who are under 40. They said, for example, women 40 and older receiving a first or third dose of the Pfizer vaccine had a respective 3 and 2 extra cases of myocarditis per 1 million women vaccinated, but there was an estimated 51 extra cases of myocarditis associated with COVID-19 infection before vaccination. Among men under 40, there were an estimated 4 extra cases of myocarditis associated with the first dose of the Pfizer vaccine and 14 extra cases with the first dose of the Moderna vaccine for every 1 million men vaccinated. That risk rose with the second dose for all 3 vaccines studied and was the highest for Moderna's, which had an additional 97 myocarditis cases per 1 million. For unvaccinated men under 40 with COVID-19, there were 16 additional myocarditis cases per million. So you're way more likely, if you're a man under 40, to get myocarditis from the vaccine than from COVID. But they claim that it's only Moderna. That is not true. Let me show you why that isn't true. Now, this is Dr. Vinay Prasad, who has been covering this and has been absolutely wonderful about this. And I'm sure he'll have some detailed analysis about this coming soon. But here is the chart here. So this, let me see if I can blow this up for you. Can you guys see that really well? Okay. So this right here is Pfizer, the first shot of Pfizer. This is the amount, this is the number of myocarditis for that first dose of Pfizer. Here is the number of myocarditis cases for the second dose of Pfizer. Here's the first dose of Moderna. Look at this. After 2 doses of Moderna, look at how this skyrockets for men under the age of 40. Here is COVID without any vaccination beforehand. So this is sort of the baseline, right? So because you have to assume everyone's going to get COVID. So if everyone is going to get COVID, this is the rate at which men per million under the age of 40 get myocarditis from COVID. So COVID is a dangerous virus. It can cause myocarditis in some men. It's 16, okay, out of the million exposed. Moderna, on the other hand, is, I mean, it's pushing 100. It's close to 100 after the second dose. That is significant. This one right here is a little under 15. This is about 14 for Moderna's first dose. So if you get just 1 dose of Moderna, then you're lower than if you were to have gotten COVID alone. But who gets 1 dose of Moderna? It's not a 1-dose regimen. It's 1 dose, and then you have to get the second dose. So you actually have to add this bar to the top of this bar to get the actual rate of myocarditis from Moderna. Because a lot of the guys got the Moderna first dose and they didn't have any myocarditis, right? The ones that got myocarditis probably did not get that second dose of Moderna. They probably got myocarditis and the doctor said, okay, no Moderna for you. That's enough. So the ones that didn't get myocarditis went on to get the second dose, and then they ended up with myocarditis. So you can't just look at these. When they broke this down in the study, this is where it gets tricky. And this is why the data for women and for people over the age of 40 needs to really be scrutinized more carefully, because you have to add those groups together. If you got the first dose and you ended up with myocarditis, you're right. You probably did not get a second dose. But if you then went on to get a second dose because you didn't get myocarditis the first shot and you got the second shot, that you have to add that together in order to compare that rate to people who just got COVID alone. So add this to the top of this bar and you end up with over 100 cases per million of young men who've ended up with myocarditis after Moderna. Now, you've got to do the same thing with Pfizer. So they're claiming in this study, or at least in the report, that it's Moderna that's the problem. They didn't say anything about Pfizer or AstraZeneca. They're saying Moderna. But here's Pfizer. When you add Pfizer's together, you're getting up there to where it is the same or even greater, because you got to then think of the third dose of Pfizer with this, and then subsequent doses that you're going to get annually, right? You've got to then add that to those who were, and compare that to the unvaccinated group. And that is equal or greater. So you can't just look at breaking it down and say, oh no, you're safer because look, the first group of Pfizer is lower than the COVID group. The second dose of Pfizer is lower than the COVID group. Same thing with Moderna. The first dose of Moderna is lower than the COVID group. No, you got to add these together. And then you end up with and then you could even add all of them together, because of course you could say, well, it doesn't really matter which vaccine you get. If you got a vaccine, then you had a higher risk of myocarditis than if you just ended up getting COVID, because these are people that got vaccinated versus unvaccinated. So if you compare the vaccinated group with the unvaccinated group, then you have to add all of this together and compare it with that 16 per 1 million. That is much higher. Now, of course, if you eliminate Moderna, so if they move forward with this and they say, okay, we're going to eliminate Moderna from circulation, we're not going to allow young men to have it, and you just go with Pfizer, then you've got to compare Pfizer with being unvaccinated. But again, that rate is a little bit higher. It's equal, if not higher. So that is, that when they tell us these things, when they say, it's fine. The article basically starts up by saying your risk of myocarditis is greater after COVID-19. They don't then give you the specifics of, except for men under the age of 40, which is a massive population. And also when they say, and if we add up all the groups together, then certainly vaccinated versus unvaccinated had a much higher risk of myocarditis than those who were unvaccinated and just caught COVID. And again, the data does not show whether or not your risk is higher if you've been vaccinated and then caught COVID. They don't go into that data. They don't have that data. They were just looking at vaccinated versus unvaccinated and the rates of myocarditis shortly after vaccination versus those who ended up getting COVID-19. They don't have the rates for those who were double, triple boosted and then went on to end up catching COVID anyway. We don't know. But this data is alarming. This should be shown. Look, if you've got a male and they're being required anywhere to get the vaccine, show them this, that this is not safe for them to be getting this vaccine at this point in time. Unless they come out with a better vaccine, but then they've got to test those, right? Then we're back to square one with that. So definitely this is something to have in your ammunition going forward. Want to keep you informed and knowing what you need in order to keep your family as safe as possible. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again very soon.